Hello, scholars. Mr. Long signing on. Today in U.S. and Virginia history, we're going to be talking about how the United States is going to rise up the ranks on the world stage and start to take its place as one of the modern empires in the world. In particular, we're going to be looking at the transition from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, with a couple acquisitions that's going to see the United States become an imperial contender, not quite the over-the-top empire that we may have seen with the British Empire or the Roman Empire in their heyday, but instead of focusing on more of smaller acquisitions that is at least going to see the United States enter the world stage on the imperial form. So let's go ahead and get started. First question we need to ask here is, what is an empire, or what is imperialism? Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. Throughout world history, we've seen a variety of empires. Just to name a few, you could look at the Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great. You could look at the Persian Empire under Cyrus or Xerxes. You can look at the Roman Empire under a litany of Roman emperors. You can also look at the British Empire, which we did here a little bit during the colonial period, the French Empire. The Germans are going to have an empire going into World War I. Belgium, little Belgium in Europe is going to have an empire to a small degree, especially in the Congo, very deep in the Congo, but not quite the world stage the way Britain and France does. For those of you that are into like the fantasy or sci-fi, you can look at my favorite empire, the Star Wars Galactic Empire. Long live the Empire, as an example of what an empire is. Why would the United States want to become an empire? Becoming an empire is going to be expensive, not just financially to spread your borders and gain influence in other countries. It's also going to cost lives, especially when imperial ambitions create wars and conflicts, and you have to send sailors, Marines, and soldiers out to exert your dominance over other areas. Many of the territories empires conquer throughout world history are not super thrilled to be subjugated or conquered by an imperial power. And so you have to have military strength and be willing to risk lives and money and time and prestige and economic power in order to control and subjugate other peoples to form your empire. So why did the US want to roll that dice and play that game? Well, here are a couple reasons here. American production boomed and the producers sought larger markets. In the previous lesson, we looked at how the robber barons and the industrialists had created these massive empires, guys like Carnegie with steel, and you can look at JP Morgan and oil. And as they started to create more of their economic power, they wanted to look at other markets to sell stuff. Oftentimes, if they're looking at other markets, let's say, Carnegie wants to sell steel to Britain. All right, Britain may want to buy steel, but you can't control how much steel Britain buys. However, if the United States was to conquer the Philippines, for example, that is a source that, because you control them, you can tell them how much steel they need to be buying, or at least have a steady market for steel. If you are the Philippines and you're an American colony or an American territory under imperialism, the United States might just say you cannot buy your steel from France or Britain or Germany, so you have to buy it from US. So it's giving more power to the robber barons and this capitalist idea of what we're going to end up calling the Gilded Age later on. The competitive yellow journalism, when we look at the Spanish-American War, in particular, the sinking of the USS Maine, the media is going to play a large part in sensationalizing, always a tricky word, sensationalizing the war to motivate people to join the war and fight in it to expand their influence. You can also look at more moralistic issues and not just dollar signs. You can look at the desire to spread American values and religion to backwards people of the world. This is a altruistic, albeit sticky situation where you have people who want to go out and do good, go around the world and teach the heathen backward peoples in the backwaters of the world about Christianity and teach them to read and teach them about hygiene and do good things. This is often referred to as the white man's burden. It's referred to the white man's burden because I forget the name, the poet who wrote it, totally blanking right now. Curses my failure. But what they wanted to do was they wanted to go out and help these people, and they felt it was their noble responsibility as good, upstanding Christians to go spread Christianity and spread goodness throughout the world. Lots of flowers and butterflies and all kinds of stuff. This is a sticky idea because it ties into the pretty common perception of racism of the time, that the white people were usually more developed, more morally upright and upstanding, that if you were non-white, you needed to be Christianized, you needed to be modernized, even against your will. And so you can go down that rabbit hole of some sticky, nasty racism, but all of that has a layer of truth to it in the historical world. Definitely a different time. The United States also has improved steel fleets. You should have looked a little bit at ironclads from the American Civil War. And as the United States creates this very modern looking Navy, well, they want to do something with it. They want to send the Navy out to go be a Navy with big guns, and they're going to be looking for an opportunity to show off their cool new toys with Spain. So a big part of this lesson here is going to be focusing on the Spanish-American War, especially with the island of Cuba, which is just to the south and east of the United States, just south of Florida. Cuba was traditionally a Spanish colony. However, the Cuban people weren't overly thrilled of the way the Spanish were ruling them. They start to revolt against the Spanish, and the Spanish are going to have to fight a guerrilla war against the Cubans. The Spanish are going to even implement something that you can call reconstruction, not reconstruction, reconcentration camps, or you want to shorten that a little bit more. These are going to look very much like concentration camps, very similar, at least in form and function, to the American concentration camps of World War II with the Japanese Americans, as well as the more infamous Nazi concentration camps and subsequent death camps of World War II. Spain is not the first people to use these concentration camps. They certainly won't be the last. Britain was doing this kind of stuff in South Africa, so this is kind of a worldwide phenomenon with some of the world powers seeing concentration camps and thinking, that's a good idea, let's do that. And that's going to be improved scientifically to horrendous results with the Germans in World War II. So while the Cuban people are rebelling against the Spanish and you have these reconcentration camps going on, the United States government is going to send the USS Maine, one of their warships, down to Havana Harbor and just kind of float around and hang out just in case crap really hits the fan, and all the American businessmen that are working in Havana need to evacuate. So they're kind of there as like the lifeboat for these American expats living and working in Cuba. In February of 1898, the USS Maine is going to explode. The newspapers are going to grab onto this very quickly, demanding war with Spain and trying to rile up the people to get back at the Spanish for sinking the ship. All the fingers are pointing at Spain. At least all the American fingers are pointing at Spain. Several inquiries are done into the Maine, and what they determine is that one of the boilers detonated and exploded the magazine, the gunpowder storage, which then blew the ship in half and killed a whole bunch of people. Tragic. Yet an accident. Spain didn't really do anything to cause it, but they're going to be the scapegoat, especially with yellow journalism and these media outlets fueling this need for war with Spain. A couple months later, in April, McKinley is going to provide a war message to Congress. So war does not come super quickly, which is interesting because it kind of shows how much momentum yellow journalism is going to play, or how much momentum the yellow journalism and the media is going to play in getting the American people and then congressmen to go for war. The Teller Amendment, This was a proclamation that after the U.S. had overthrown Spanish rule in Cuba during the subsequent Spanish-American War, the U.S. would give Cuba their independence, and the United States is actually going to stick to that one after the war, which we'll look at. The war itself, in the grand scheme of things, not the most interesting war. There are definitely some cool stories. There's a story about the Spanish fleet in the Philippines who was outgunned and outmatched by the American Navy, and yet they bravely sailed out of the, I think it was Manila Bay in the Philippines, and was subsequently destroyed. But it was one of those great last stands of just, this is our job. We're going to go out there and go down swinging. One notable exception is Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders are going to be propagandized pretty thoroughly in the decades after the Spanish-American War, especially whenever he becomes president. However, the true value of his military unit in the campaign is kind of been exaggerated, probably wasn't as important as people, Teddy Roosevelt fans, want you to think they are. So we're not going to spend too much time on them, but there's a lot of really interesting color commentary about the war if you want to go dive deeper into that. By the end of the war, only 400 Americans were killed by bullets. I say only because we're going to compare those 400 caskets to 5,000 from diseases and other causes. Cuba is a tropical island. There's lots of malaria, lots of dengue, lots of nasty diseases in the jungles, which is going to kill more soldiers than bullets. Most wars, including this one, are going to see more people die, more soldiers die from disease and starvation than actual combat itself. It's not until really World War I that we start to see this shift with more, with the way healthcare catches up and nutrition catching up, that soldiers aren't dying from disease and starvation anymore, and now they're more dying from bullets or shrapnel or bayonets or what have you. So as far as the war itself, 400 casualties from bullets is a pretty small price to pay in the grand scheme of things. Still pretty horrible for those 400 families, but compared to other wars, this one's pretty small. The treaty is going to be signed in Paris, so we're going to have another Treaty of Paris. There's already like a dozen of those. Spain is going to cede Cuba. They're going to give Cuba their freedom thanks to the Teller Amendment. Spain is also going to give Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States, therefore giving the United States the starter pack in imperialism. Here are some of the outcomes from the specific expansion. Some of these you should have just seen on the slide. You have the Philippines over here. You have Guam over here. Cuba's over here. And then Puerto Rico is going to become a United States territory. United States still has some control over these regions. The Philippines is going to gain their independence after World War II, so about 50 to 60 years after this. All the while, the Filipino people weren't super thrilled about having the Americans coming in. When the Americans defeated the Spanish, the Filipinos thought that, oh, cool, we're going to be free. And then they soon realized that the Filipino people just traded one villain in the Spanish for another oppressive villain in the form of the United States. So there's another rich history there of guerrilla warfare and a lot of nastiness going on that we're not going to get into during this unit. Some interesting things, geographically speaking, these territories in Guam and Philippines are going to give the United States easier access to markets such as Japan and China, which is going to be good for trading, whereas before all the goods had to go straight across the ocean, but now you have refuel and resupply points at Guam and the Philippines to help push out manufactured goods. So guys like Carnegie and JP Morgan are going to be pretty excited about having a launch pad into Asia. Spanish-American War is also significant for helping bring the country back together, as seen in this very propagandized photograph. This is very much not a candid photo. This is very, very posed. But in this photo, which is probably one of my top 10 favorite photos from American history, we have two figures shaking hands. If I can find my stylus, there it is. So we have this guy here. He's dressed in a gray uniform, much like the Confederate States of America would have worn. You have this guy wearing the Yankee blue of the American Civil War Union military. They are shaking hands in front of a little girl with a crown, and I'm not sure if you can see the crown, but the crown says Cuba. So this is symbolic of the nation of Cuba and the innocence of what the Americans perceived Cuba as, with the North and South coming back together after the American Civil War. So this is 40 years after the American Civil War. By the time we get to 1898, about 40 years, so like 1865 to 1898. I guess technically 33, but I'm not a math teacher. I'm a history teacher, so I'm not going to do that math. But this is the first time that North and South really came together for a common cause. There was still a lot of bitter resentment after the Civil War, given this is 33 years after the end of the war. So there's still plenty of American Civil War veterans walking around for the most part. They haven't quite started to die off from natural causes yet. And so there's still a lot of bad blood there. But having the opportunity to come together to defend the dignity and innocence of little Cuba is going to be a nice photo op for North and South to come together. In the photo, you also see some more symbolism. You have the Cuban flag in the middle. You also have the chains of bondage that bonded little Cuba to Spain being broken by the North and South of the United States coming together to free Cuba with a Teller Amendment to give them their independence, which is going to be, grand scheme of things, the sun still rises in the east and sets in the west, but at least it's a good photo op for North and South and Cuba, or at least this little girl pretending to be Cuba. Let's see if there's anything specific. Also, Pacific, good. Over here, you'll see the state of Hawaii. Well, at this point, it's the Kingdom of Hawaii. This is going to be taken over by the United States in a pretty shady story that still has local Hawaiians kind of upset about it. Fair enough. It's a shady back alley, kind of like drug deal kind of thing that saw the U.S. Marines coming in and taking over Hawaii, deposing the last queen of Hawaii that I will not try to pronounce because I'll probably butcher it and get yelled at by my Hawaiian friends. So I'm not going to make an attempt at that. But for our class, at least acknowledge that the United States is also going to gain Hawaii during this age of imperialism in a pretty shady deal that really wasn't fair to all parties involved, especially with the Hawaiians. Here's a quick slide on some of the stuff with Hawaii. Technically, the United States is going to annex Hawaii. I'm not going to dive too deep into the symbolism here, but this fellow with the giant beard, this is going to be Sanford B. Dole, as in the Dole cannery for like Dole fruits. If you ever look at like a little cup of pineapples, it's probably the Dole cannery. It's a pretty cool place. If you're ever in Hawaii on Oahu, head over there and grab some awesome pineapple soft serve. Delicious. But he was a big businessman. He was an American industrialist who was living in Hawaii. He really wanted to have American security and American authority in Hawaii to kind of do his own thing. And so we're going to have him kind of presenting Hawaii to the United States after the shady deal, at which case the president at the time, there he is, William McKinley, this guy here, he's going to be serving as best man, kind of uniting Hawaii with Uncle Sam, who's not super sure about this idea. So again, little kind of some bad blood, little shadiness going on here, yet Hawaii is going to become a territory. It's going to play home to the Battle of Pearl Harbor that's going to bring the United States into World War II in December of 1941. And subsequently, it's going to become a state, which it still is today. So cool beaches and delicious pineapple. Love going to Hawaii when I can, which isn't ever often enough. So that's all I have for you guys today. Hopefully you guys picked up a little bit on what imperialism is. The United States in general, pretty late to the game there, but they're still able to grab some territories after kicking some Spanish butt and some shady deals in Hawaii. Hopefully you guys picked up on a few of the reasons why the United States would want to expand an empire, create an empire, such as access to markets. They're also going to want access to raw materials to make more stuff with, because capitalism. And they have a brand new, or fairly new military that they want to show off and get some cool stuff with it. Because what's the point of having a big military if you can't do stuff with it, historically speaking, that is. So that's all I have for you guys today. Hopefully you guys are completing the rest of the lessons. Submit your questions to me as soon as possible. And I will see you guys in class next. I think that's all I got. So if you guys have any questions, shoot me an email or see me in class. Mr. Long, over and out.